In this video, we're going to be looking at the topic of genetics and how it links to evolution. So in previous chapters, you've looked at evolution by natural selection. In this topic, we're going to look at, first of all, some of the evidence that we have to support the theory of evolution. And we're also going to look at some of the wider aspects of this concept. So for example, extinction, and looking at how we actually classify organisms as well. And if you're doing separates, you need to learn a bit more about the history of genetics, especially about the different scientists who have basically contributed to our understanding of genetics and evolution nowadays. So let's start with the evidence for evolution. Generally speaking, we say that there are two major pieces of evidence. First of all is fossils. So fossils are basically the remains of old organisms that have died and decayed millions of years ago, and it takes millions of years to form. And the idea is that we can see the changes to the organisms through these fossils. Now, there are different ways that fossils can be formed, and the most typical one that, like the ones that we see in museums, would be after the softer parts of the organism decayed or decomposed, the bones were replaced, are buried underground, and they were replaced with minerals inside. So this is called mineralization. So eventually, the tougher bone tissues will still decay away, but because of the minerals that have gone into it, it will almost like form a cast. So you are making essentially rocks, or really tough bone-like rocks that essentially would be the fossils that we see nowadays. So we can basically compare those fossils and looking at the bone structure, for example, and then you can see any changes to the particular species over time. Some of the other fossils will be things like softer organisms that are trapped inside a tree sap that can form amber. It could also be that there is a particular change in the environment that stops the organism from decaying. So there's a really famous example of a baby mammoth that was frozen in ice, essentially, and because of the cold, the bacteria wasn't able to decay the flesh, and therefore the whole mammoth was intact with the fur and the muscles and everything, which is very, very cool. We can also have imprints of softer organisms, like a footprint or like an imprint of a plant, and all of those formed rocks over time, and we get fossils. But ultimately, regardless of how the fossils are made, we're trying to see and compare how the fossils, how the structures shown in the fossils might be similar or different to the organisms we see nowadays, and to figure out how those changes might have come about, leading to evidence for evolution. However, there are certain problems with the use of fossils. So first of all, not all organisms can form fossils. So the earlier life forms that are softer bodied, they are not able to form fossils, like jellyfish. So we have lost that information. It will be difficult for us to get any information or evidence from that particular area in time. Another problem is that sometimes the fossils are destroyed. So remember that they are usually found buried underground. So when the tectonic plates move, for example, it might just crush up the fossil or break the fossil in half, so we don't have the full fossil record. Another point is that we haven't discovered all of the fossils yet. There isn't really a machine that can automatically detect fossils for us. So there might be some around us that we haven't actually discovered yet. So if we don't discover them, we don't have the records, then we are missing those information when looking at evolution. So fossils are helpful in terms of helping us seeing the physical features of organisms from millions of years ago, but we have these sort of barriers in place that could mean that we're missing information, so we don't have the full picture. So the other type of evidence for evolution would be antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So this is probably something that we can see happening during our lifetime, because bacteria divides very quickly, once every 20 minutes. So it is a real problem we have in the medical world, but it actually can also work as an evidence for evolution. So the whole concept here is, it's kind of the process itself is similar to just natural selection. There is random mutation in bacterial population, and some of those mutated ones gain the resistant gene. So it could be through mutation, or it could be through the fact that they gained the plasmid that carries the antibiotic resistant gene. In any case, there is variation within the bacterial population, and those with that mutated gene can survive and produce better despite being exposed to the antibiotic, whereas all of the other ones will be killed by the antibiotic. And over time, as they reproduce, they are making more bacteria that also carries that resistant gene, and over time the whole population has resistance against the antibiotic. So it's the same model of natural selection, and this time it's about resistance against that antibiotic. So from that note, we kind of also need to consider what the implications are in medicine. So for medical professions, they also need to consider how to reduce the spread of antibiotic resistance, because as you would imagine, it is bad for the bacteria to gain resistance, because that means that we are no longer able to kill those pathogenic bacteria. So there are a few things you need to be aware of when it comes to reducing the spread of antibiotic resistance. So first of all, you want to use a very specific antibiotic for certain serious infections. So you don't use just any antibiotic, you only assign one particular one for that particular bacteria. And the idea is that you are not exposing the bacteria to all kinds of antibiotic, which increases the chance of them, having the opportunity to evolve to become resistant to multiple antibiotics. And the idea of a serious infection would imply that the body's immune system won't be capable of killing the bacteria itself. And the idea, again, if it's a mild infection or even in case that it's a viral infection, you do not use antibiotic because it wouldn't work. As patients, you want to make sure that you complete the full course of the antibiotic. So if you've been prescribed 7 days of antibiotics, you need to make sure that you finish all of the 7 days, even if you feel better after 4 days. Because the idea is that some of the if we draw a graph, as you start to eat the antibiotic or take the antibiotic, the number of bacteria start to go down. However, at this point, you will start to feel better. But the thing is, there is still some bacteria left, which means that they may have the resistant gene, which means that volume or that concentration of antibiotic is not enough to kill them. So if you stop taking the antibiotic, then the numbers will crop back up, and the thing is, all of those would be resistant. So you want to make sure that you keep taking the antibiotic until to a point that you make sure all of the bacteria has died. So you are, as patients, we are always prescribed a bit more antibiotic than we actually need. And the idea is that to ensure that all of the bacteria or any potential resistant strains of bacteria in our system are completely killed. Another point is to restrict the use of antibiotics in agriculture. So sometimes farmers, they want to reduce the risk of animals, for example, from getting infected, because the idea is that then they will be using up extra energy to recover instead of using the energy to growing more meat or milk. So farmers may then start to use antibiotics and mix it in with their feed and their food, and the idea is to almost like use it as a prevention of an infection. However, that again exposes the antibiotic to lots and lots of different bacteria in the animals or in the farms, again increasing the risk of them sort of developing antibiotic resistance, so to speak. So these are two pieces of evidence for evolution, and looking at some of the reasons why, for example, fossils, it's not a complete record, so we need to evaluate the use of fossils, and in terms of antibiotic resistance, how we might consider our use of it in everyday life. So another aspect of this topic you need to know about is extinction. So the concept of extinction is that all members of a species are dead. There is none of the species left behind. The difference between an extinction and a mass extinction is, in the mass extinction, we say that 70 to 90% of all species on the planet have completely been wiped out. So that's the difference there. So in historical times, we've had 5 mass extinction events, but that is not the focus here so much, but we're going to look at the causes of extinction, and in particular I'll mention a bit of the potential reasons for the mass extinction. So first of all, there might be new predators. So change in the ecosystem or in the community means that the new predator came in and basically ate and killed all of the prey, and that means the prey population or the prey species would be completely wiped out and become extinct if there isn't enough time for them to recover. Alternatively, there might be a new competition in the community. So another species came in and they are, for example, better at competing, or they outcompeted the original species for food, for water, for territory, for mate, whatever it might be. Although the last one might be unlikely unless it's a plant. But the idea is that they outcompeted the other species, and therefore that other species will die because of the lack of resources. When it comes to mentioning competition, make sure you mention, where possible, like specific examples of resources that they're competing for. So food and water are probably going to be two major examples here. A third reason will be a new disease or a new pathogen that is in the area, and again, that pathogen might kill a lot of the species before they could actually rather than surviving. So climate change might be another reason as well, which is a bigger reason, shall we say, because it's affecting potentially lots of different species instead of just one or two. And one of the potential reasons for mass extinction as well would be climate change. So again, a change in the ecosystem, which means that their food source might disappear, they destroy their habitat, there's no shelter. All of these could lead to the death of organisms. Finally, a catastrophic event might cause extinction as well as mass extinction, actually. Again, these are examples of like volcanic eruptions, or a meteor strike or asteroid landing on the planet, which could kill lots of organisms in a very short amount of time. And if that area has just all of the species a species lives there and nowhere else, then obviously they will be wiped out in that single catastrophic event. But in particular, climate change and that catastrophic event may be causes of mass extinctions in the past, but otherwise, new predators, competition, and diseases are the usual major reasons for extinction. And you will be asked to name, sometimes in exams, to give, for example, 2 reasons for extinction. So just remember any 2 off this list. So for the combined aspect of the course, the last thing you need to know is about classification. So classification is the idea of grouping organisms based on their similar characteristics. So it would help the study of organisms and the process of evolution and the timeline of evolution. So for this part, you need to know a few things. You need to know, first of all, is the actual classification system, so how we might group organisms. And we are also going to look at how we name organisms used under this particular system and the 2 scientists who came up with the system. So in the past, there was a scientist called Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus basically came up with the Linnaean classification, where we started with the largest group would be kingdom. So for example, we can have the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, which are the typical ones that we talk about. And then once the organisms are grouped into the same kingdom, then they can be split into phylum, which is the smaller group there, then class, then order, then family, then genus, and species. So it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So a species is the smallest possible group, and for example, human species, we are in one particular group and there is no more subspecies, so to speak, in terms of humans. In reality, there would be subspecies for certain types of organisms, but that won't be our focus in the topic today. Now, in particular, we use genus and species for binomial or scientific naming. So, for example, for humans, we are called Homo sapiens. So what that means is that we belong to the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. So what that means is there are other organisms that belong to that are also in the genus Homo, but there are still differences between us and that species. Therefore, we are put into the species of Sapiens. Binomial naming is actually in Latin. So in Latin, when you're typing up Latin, you need to type in italics. However, because of writing, we can't write in italics, so we're going to have to underline the words. So you will also notice there are certain rules. So for example, the first letter of the genus must be in capital letter, and whereas the first letter in the species name must be in small letters, same as the rest of that. So a few things: capital letter for the first letter for genus, small letters for all of that, and you must underline the whole name to represent that it is in Latin. So the Linnaeus classification system is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. In a question, they might have a table, and they will have some of these, for example, some of these groups blanked out, and you need to fill in that table with the correct one. So for example, if they missed out the gap in between class and family like that, then you need to make sure that you're able to state that, between that would be order, for example. In the past, Linnaeus basically used all the fossils, for example, plus a bit of other information and records to formulate this system, and we were able to put all of the organisms underneath this system. However, later on, as technology develops and knowledge develops, we actually have got more information on the DNA and proteins of organisms, and therefore Carl Woese, who is the other scientist in the 90s, basically came up with an additional group on top of kingdom, which is called domain. So within domain, there are 3 domains in particular. We've got archaea, which means ancient bacteria. So these are usually extremophiles, and they are formed since the beginning of life. And that is separated from just normal bacteria, which will be typical of the bacteria we find nowadays. And separate from that would be the domain eukaryota, which, as you might recognize, it's basically eukaryote or eukaryotic organisms that has a nucleus. So for example, animals, plants, fungi, protists, we all belong under the same domain eukaryota, but then you can separate them otherwise into the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. So exam questions may ask you to state which domain an organism might be under, but there will be information in the question that gives you hints. So for example, if you notice that it is not a bacteria, then it must be under the domain eukaryota. So for the kingdom, it's unlikely they will ask you that in this much detail, but just so they're aware that we can have Archaebacteria kingdom under the domain Archaea, so these are the ancient bacteria, and we can have Eubacteria, which is the kingdom underneath bacteria, so like I said, typical ones that we have, whereas under the a domain Eukaryota, we can have things like fungi and protists, like the ones in malaria, or we call them Protoctista. We can also have the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. So that's the classification system. Now, based on the classification system, from there we can actually make something called evolutionary trees or phylogenetic trees. So these evolutionary trees, the reason why they're called trees is because it kind of have branches essentially. So we start from the center point here, and it can branch off into many different bits to show the different species. And the idea is that based on the concept of natural selection and speciation, we are all originally evolved from one common ancestor. So there might be different ways to present an evolutionary tree. Some of them look like this, going upright. Some of them look similar, but they have right angles instead of these V-shaped angles. They might be going sideways as well, from left to right. But the idea is that it's always showing a particular direction. It's always showing a timeline there. So this is the past where the common ancestor was, and then it extends up to the present day. And the closer they are on the evolutionary tree, then the more closely related they would be, and that would also mean that they've only recently split into 2 different species. So for example, species A and B will be closely related to each other because of the recent split. Species D and E will be closely related to each other because of the recent split as well. However, we can say that both A and E, yes, they are sort of related because, like I said, they all come from the same common ancestor at this bottom point here. However, they will be less closely related if we were to compare A and B itself, because they evolved and split up many, many years ago. Another thing you could also see is that we got species C here, and the branch for C stopped there. That means that it is no longer existing in the present day, so that means organism C is now extinct. So the tree is a graphical way to show evolutionary relationships and also the timeline. So exam questions may ask you to study and look at an example of an evolutionary tree and then ask you to interpret it. So that's the overview of the topic of genetics and evolution. However, if you are going to be studying the separate biology, then you need to know a little bit more about the history of genetics. So in particular, you need to know about these 4 scientists, and essentially you need to know what they did and how they contributed towards our understanding on genetics and evolution. In particular, we need to notice a bit more or talk a bit more about Darwin, and also for Wallace in particular, and I'll expand on that one when we get there. So first of all, let's have Mendel. So Mendel was actually a monk, and in his spare time he was growing pea plants, and he was the first one who discovered that characteristics can be inherited as particular units. So this is before we even know cells sort of exist. We didn't have the microscope even, obviously, at that point, so that's why we didn't know cells exist, so let alone the concept of DNA and genes. But he discovered that characteristics can be passed on, and there is a particular way that they work. He basically help pioneer the concept that, perhaps we can look at how these characteristics are, or these units are inherited, which we then know that the units are later on called genes. And then we got Darwin and Lamarck. Now, interestingly, Darwin, Lamarck, and Wallace, they all 3 of them basically exist at the same time. And they were all working on the theory of evolution as well. Not necessarily together, but at the same time. Now, as we know, Darwin was the person who proposed the correct theory of evolution, which is that this is using the natural selection mechanism, where nature selects who survives and who dies, as we mentioned in previous chapters. However, Darwin's theory was not widely accepted in the past when he first basically suggested it, because of several reasons. First of all, it challenged the concept of creationism, where the God created everything. So back then, it was a very religious society, and a lot of people believed that God created the universe and everything, and Darwin's concept of how we were not created by God, but might have evolved from different organisms, basically challenged that concept, that very well believed concept, so his ideas were not easily accepted. Another reason is that back then Darwin was mainly using fossils and also studying on different organisms in the Galapagos Islands. And yes, he has noticed that there are different adaptations of organisms and leading to natural selection, but it wasn't enough there wasn't enough evidence to really back it up fully. So he had evidence, but it wasn't enough. Also, another thing is that back then there is still no understanding of how characteristics can be inherited. And again, similar to Mendel, there was no concept of genes yet, or DNA. So there is no way of just saying, we now know it's called a favorable allele. We got genes that help get a code for certain characteristics, but back then there was no understanding of that. So Darwin essentially was kind of ahead of his time. He noticed the trend and he proposed a potential theory of natural selection, but there was just not enough evidence to back it up, plus other various aspects in the society then. And as I said, at the same time, Lamarck and Wallace were also working on the theory of how evolution might have occurred. And Lamarck, interestingly, proposed a slightly different theory. He suggested that any adaptations that an organism gained within its lifetime can be passed on and be inherited by their offspring, which we obviously now know it is wrong. So what that essentially is saying, if Lamarck's theory is correct, then if a person has gotten a tattoo within its lifetime, then that person then has a baby, then the baby will be born having that tattoo, which we know is not possible. So it's often being compared, his theory was compared with Darwin to show how Lamarck's theory is about the adaptations that are gained can be passed on, which means we can choose what characteristics to pass on, whereas Darwin is saying, nope, all of those variations and adaptations were in place already, it's just that some can survive and some dies. Now Wallace, interestingly, he actually worked out the same theory of evolution as Darwin. He also thought that evolution happened by natural selection, but Darwin actually proposed that theory before Wallace, so that's why he was a bit more famous in this aspect. However, Wallace actually continued working to get alongside Darwin to basically almost help him gather more evidence to support the theory of evolution by natural selection. But other than that, he was actually more well known for some of his other additional work, which he basically worked on while he was gathering evidence. one of which is the warning coloration shown by certain animals, for example, so how they might change color when they face danger. Another thing that he's really famous for is the concept of speciation. So speciation is referring to the process of when a new species arises, when you're making a new species. So this is usually happening as a result of natural selection, which is the concept of evolution. So evolution could be about how it's still the same species, but you're just changing a certain characteristic or adaptation or phenotype. However, if this process of natural selection continues over many, many generations and there has been new mutations or new adaptations in place, the species that is then formed is so different from the original one that they can no longer interbreed. So that's what we call it as a completely new species, hence the word speciation. So this is usually the case for the end result of natural selection, although having said that, artificial selection, like selective breeding, may also lead to speciation. And there are two usual triggers for speciation. So there are geographical changes or environmental changes. So this is on top of our typical just selection pressure or like random mutation for variation. So we're saying that there is variation still to start with, but then let's say within the same species population, they got separated. Let's say there's an earthquake separating the two groups and they went to two very different environments and different habitats with various different environmental changes, which meant that in those two different places, different characteristics will actually be selected as the favorable ones. So let's say one group drifted to a cold area, then obviously any adaptation to help them survive the cold would be beneficial. Let's say you are more fur or you have a thicker layer of fat. Whereas the other group have drifted to a hot area, then any characteristics or adaptations to help them survive the heat would therefore be beneficial. So that triggers two directions of natural selection to happen. One to be adapting towards the cold, the other adapting towards the heat. So that ultimately drives the group from one species into two different species because of the difference in their geographical or environments that they are in. So that was particularly the work of Wallace that he basically proposed as he was working on, like I said, getting evidence for natural selection. And you can see that there are some connections between speciation and natural selection and evolution. So if you're doing separate sciences for biology, then you need to know about these four scientists in a bit more detail. The questions that you might get asked would be, for example, a multiple choice question where they ask you to tick the name of the scientists that proposed or worked on a particular theory or knowledge in genetics. Another question would be, maybe they would say, give two reasons why Darwin's theory of evolution was not accepted at his time. It could also be that, they ask you questions on speciation in particular about what that means.